We're going to go for about an hour and a half here. We're going to speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, then we'll open it up at the end for questions and answers. So thank you again for coming to Hudson, and thank you to our C-SPAN audience, and thank you for this wonderful panel with Elliot Abrams and Brian Katulis. Elliot Abrams was Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy Strategy during the George W. Bush administration. He is currently a Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author, most recently, of Tested by Zion, the Bush administration and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Brian Katulis is a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he focuses on the Middle East and North Africa. He is co-author of The Prosperity Agenda, What the World Wants from America and What We Need in Return. There are also a couple of articles by Brian Katulis over there on the site. I think they're still available. And about Brian's recent work on Saudi Arabia, which will fill us in a bit. In the meantime, I want Mr. Abrams to make a few comments at first, and then Brian will, and then we'll have a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I wanted to start by saying that some of the discussion of U.S. Saudi relations, I think, is overdone. The sense of a hopeless crisis that will result in incurable differences. This is an old relationship, roughly 75 years old. Aramco was founded in 1944, and there have been a lot of ups and downs. I mean, whatever the challenge is today, think of 1973, the Arab oil embargo, which you could, in a certain sense, call an act of war by the Saudis against the United States, or think of 2001. So the relationship has been through crises and survived them. And another positive point, the relationship is more supple, thicker today than in many years in the past. That is, there have been times, I think, when the relationship was king-president. That was about it. You now have an institutionalized relationship. There is a mill-mill relationship. There's a CIA-Saudi intel relationship. There's a DHS-Saudi Interior Ministry relationship, FBI. There's a Treasury Ministry of Finance relationship. It doesn't just depend on one or two individuals. Obviously, the relationship is based to a very large degree on oil, but even there, I think one should expand that a little. There was an alliance during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. There was an alliance after 1979 against Iran. There was also an American appreciation over the last decades of what I would call professional, reliable Saudi handling of oil as the world's swing oil supplier, and of money by the Saudi Treasury and investment authorities. It has been an alliance of two very, very different societies. That can be hidden. I mean, if you're an American official, you know, dealing with Foreign Minister Saud, who's a graduate of Princeton, you don't have the sense that you're dealing with someone who cannot navigate your culture. But still, these are two very, very different societies when it comes to matters like religious freedom, political freedom, treatment of women. I think that's going to be a growing problem. It wasn't a big problem for many decades. We had a lot of allies that were very different societies and that were, in some cases, pretty unattractive dictatorships, starting with Joseph Stalin in World War II. And we went through a long period in the Cold War when the internal situation in a friendly country didn't matter to us. It matters more and more now as human rights values get, I hate this word, but globalized, and as America pays over time generally more attention to those questions. We no longer just say, oh, well, that's a different culture. And I think that's going to be more important because What has been missing for over the decades has been the Saudi end of that. That is, we heard from the royal family. We didn't hear from the people of Saudi Arabia. There was no visible civil society in Saudi Arabia. There is now, partly because of technology. I mean, now there's Twitter, now there are blog posts. Now the Saudi people appear just a little bit as actors. That's got to increase, it seems to me. And that will increase over years when Saudi oil is less important to us because of all these trends toward North American energy independence. One would have to assume that Saudi influence in Washington will decline rather than growing. There's obviously a crisis of confidence here today over Syria, over Egypt, and particularly over Iran. And I think that the Saudis have relied on us since 1979 to be in a confrontation with Iran, and we have been. And they're very worried, I think, that now the United States may decide not to be in a confrontation with Iran. And of course, our views of Iran are fundamentally different from theirs. Their problem is this is a powerful Persian Shia country. Our problem is with the Islamic Republic. And if it weren't the Islamic Republic, if it were a democratic Iran, our problems would largely disappear, but it's not at all clear the Saudis' problems would disappear. We can come back to that. I would just add one other thing. The crisis that we're having in relations now, the difficulties in relations, the lack of good communication, which I think can partly be blamed on the administration, but of course several of the top people in Saudi Arabia are very old and sick, and having the kind of relationship we had, let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, would be far more difficult today. Saudi Arabia may, in the next few years, enter a succession crisis. The king is over 90 and not in good health. The crown prince is apparently in worse health. You look at the statistics, we may get a succession crisis during the Obama administration. Never, I think it's fair to say, since the establishment of this government by Ibn Saud, have we not known who's next. It's not at all clear that Crown Prince Salman can take over, is well enough to take over. And you have that succession problem at a time when the Saudis are reaching the end of the brothers and are going to have to confront the question of going to the next generation. And that happens at a moment when tension with the United States is as high as it has been, certainly since 2001. And our influence at the top in Saudi Arabia is, I think, as small as it has been in a very long time. That's an unfortunate combination of events. I should stop there and turn the mic back.
Yeah, Brian, great. Thank you, Lee. And first, at the outset, I want to say happy holidays to you all, especially those of you who may be watching on C-SPAN and the rebroadcast, as they often do over there. Because if you're watching this, you should be watching It's a Wonderful Life. That's what I'll be doing. But we hope we have a good discussion here. And second, thank you, Lee and Elliot. And thanks to the Hudson Institute and for all the work that you do. I'm obviously from a center-left think tank, but I don't agree with a lot of what you write in the Weekly Standard, or Elliot and I have been on panels, but I
agree with everything.
I'm enriched by it and your thinking, and I hope the dialogue here today and all of the work. Yesterday I was just reading the latest edition of Current Trends in Islamist Ideology, which is a great publication this institution
published by Hudson.
Puts out. And again, even if I don't agree with it, it helps enliven my thinking, and I think it's very good. What I wanted to do at the outset was maybe make three overall points just to get the discussion going. One, a snapshot on U.S. Saudi relations based on the statements from Saudi leaders. Second, a brief assessment of what I see Saudi strategy and how they're doing. And then third, a comment on U.S. strategy to structure it that way. First, just to start out to show you how bad things had become in the U.S.-Saudi relations, three quotes. One, a letter from Abdullah to the President of the United States. At a time when peoples and nations part, we are at a crossroads. It is time for the United States and Saudi Arabia to look at their separate interests. Second, a Saudi official here in Washington saying that Abdullah, quote, doesn't mince words like the president. If the U.S. doesn't do more to reduce the violence, and here he was talking in the West Bank and Gaza, there will be grave consequences for U.S. interests. And then third, from a diplomatic cable, a U.S. diplomat writing about Abdullah, talking about a visit he had with a U.S. diplomat. U.S. policy has now given Iraq to Iran as a gift on a golden platter. This diplomat wrote, King Abdullah was upset and was somewhat emotional, while not specific, even appeared to be questioning the bona fides of U.S. policy. I highlight these statements because they come from 2001, 2002, and 2005. And I think there's been a lot of chatter about the most recent statements and quite, visible protestations about U.S. policy. But to demonstrate that there has been a certain consistency of criticism, and Elliot, I'm sure, experienced this in the Bush administration, coming from Saudi Arabia. For those of you who speak Arabic, when I've read the recent comments and also these past comments, the phrase hakifadi came to mind in terms of empty talk. Talk that I think in some ways doesn't necessarily reflect the core interest, which I think there's still strong interests. And I fundamentally agree with Elliot that there's a values disconnect between our two nations, and I hope we talk about that. But I think ultimately we've heard through the years a lot of talk, and I think an over-analysis as U.S. policy has shifted, whether it was last decade or currently, trying to adjust to the complicated currents in the Middle East. Saudis have often talked a lot, but when you look at what they do, it's actually sometimes quite different. Second point I wanted to make was about the Saudi strategy, and I asked Lee if he wouldn't mind handing out a paper I did two years ago, and I think some of it is still relevant, but then also a recent article about U.S. Saudi relations. But the paper 2 years ago was an interesting exercise to look at how Saudi Arabia itself defined its national security interests. Quite often we as analysts here in America look at things from our lens, and quite naturally, what do we get out of this relationship? But it was interesting for me to interview people not only in the government, but then outside of the government in the sector that Elliot has talked about, the NGO sector. And my main conclusion, and you can disagree with this, but my main conclusion there was that Saudi Arabia punches far below its weight, given its considerable resources, both oil resources, given its conventional military power, something that successive U.S. administrations have had something to do with. And given its unique status in the Islamic world, if you neutrally try to assess what its stated objectives, especially over the last 10 years, it has not done a good job in advancing its own stated self-interests. We can talk about the Islamist ideology and the support for radicals. I hope we talk about that because I think it's a complicated picture, it's an important one, and a very dangerous one. But quite simply, over the last 10 years, the Saudis have said they don't want Iranian influence to spread through the region. What they've seen in Iraq, in Lebanon, in the Palestinian territories, is the spread of Iranian influence, and we can talk about why that's the case. The Saudis have also said they'd like to advance for a decade now, the Arab Peace Initiative. But if you go to them and ask what is your actual strategy, what's your tactics also connected to that strategy to get that done, again, grumbles and complaints, but not a clear strategy. And then finally, I'll just say, despite its considerable oil wealth, if you look at the situation inside, not only in terms of governance and human rights, which is troubling, and I as a progressive am troubled by that, when you look at how wealthy the country should be, and you look at the economic inequalities, and the substantial internal challenges they're going to already have and will have when it comes to energy subsidies, dealing with a very young population, almost every day you'll see this, and you'll see this if you look at the Arabic news today. Protests in a certain part of Saudi Arabia right now. They've been able to keep a lid on this through repression, through using their considerable resources. But if you look at sort of the long-term trends as a clinical analyst, it's hard for me to see how this all hangs together. And this is kind of complementary to Elliot's point. Finally, and I'm sorry for going on here, the last point on U.S. policy. And again, I would highlight, and I think Elliot may disagree with me, many in the room may disagree with me, but I would highlight that over the last 10 years, I've seen a remarkable continuity in terms of the broad strokes of U.S. policy, and not only U.S. Saudi policy, but broad policy in the region. I think what's changed quite a lot is the overall strategic context, and Elliot has talked about this. You know, from 1933 till 2003, it was quite easier to define and discern what was the relationship. And I'll quibble with sort of the title even of this session because it's technically not an alliance. We have alliances with European partners. Israel is a major non-NATO ally. Saudi Arabia has been a marriage of interests at certain points. Oil was at the core, oil and security was at the core of that bargain. But for decades, the U.S. viewed Saudi Arabia as an important partner to check Soviet influences. For decades, Saudi Arabia viewed the U.S. as a country that it could turn to when it faced challenges from Arab nationalism and Nasser, and then post-1979 to contain the Iranian influence. Now, whatever you think about the dual containment strategy of the United States in the 1990s, containing Iran and Iraq, when the Iraq War happened in 2003, and I know there's a lot of criticisms of it, but my deepest concern was that it changed the strategic paradigm in the region for the United States. That this policy has created for the last 10 years, I think, a situation of strategic drift, and one where there's been a lot of tactical reactive crisis management. And here I'm not assessing this from the level of presidential speeches, whether it be President Bush or President Obama, but in terms of actual U.S. policy, it's been quite a muddle and quite tactical in terms of not certain what it wants to achieve. But back to the U.S. Saudi relationship, I think in this period of competition for influence within the region, Saudi Arabia is one of many actors trying to throw its weight around in many ways. There are still some mainstays, and Elliot mentioned this. The counterterrorism cooperation is actually quite strong on some levels, but worrisome when you talk about Syria and other things. And that, I think, is, we could talk for the whole session about this. The weapons relationship, the military relationship, is quite strong, as you noticed earlier this month. Another sizable anti-tank missile delivery from the United States from Raytheon. The differences are, we'll get into. Iran, quite clearly, I think why they've been stating publicly their concerns and various Saudi royals. But again, you ask them if they've accepted this interim agreement and whether they've accepted Secretary Hagel's recent visit to the region. I think strip away all of the rhetoric, you'll see there's a pragmatism that's there. Syria, big divide, and I hope we talk a lot about that. Egypt, again, serious differences, but I think can be navigated, which is where I'll close. And I think despite sort of the tensions, I think there's common interests, I think divergence of values, which I agree with Elliot here, we need to talk about. But if I had one advice for this current administration, what I hear quite a lot when I'm in the region, when I hear from our friends in Saudi Arabia and GCC, is that there's nobody that they perceive inside the Obama White House or the administration as their go-to person, somebody that they can talk to. Again, not because we love them and share their values, but in terms of effectively advancing our policy interests, that would be one recommendation of they want somebody that they can talk to and listen to. And I think in some ways their public statements are a reflection of their own self-frustration with the ineffectiveness of their own strategy to advance their own goals, but also the sense of, well, maybe the U.S. doesn't like us anymore, and the sense of uncertainty. And I would submit to you that that's not a bad thing for U.S. policy. It may be a potential for leverage if it's exercised in some sort of way. But again, going back to this broader point, that I don't think we know what we want writ large in the region. And I think this is a problem not only of the Obama administration, but its predecessor, because there was a lot of confused mixed messages there. So I think we're at a complicated point, but I don't see a major break coming, and I think it definitely needs to be definitely managed.
Well, thanks, Brian. That's terrific, and thanks, Elliot. There's a lot to go on those two statements. I want to say, Brian, hearing you speak, one of the things that I think the three of us agree on when you talk about the different problems with certainly coming up in Saudi society, and Elliot spoke about this too. I think the three of us agree that it would actually be a good thing, a positive thing, if the United States and American policymakers had an active role in helping to steer Saudi society in a positive direction rather than a dangerous direction.
You know, in the old days, and there were very many of them, when Bandar was ambassador here, he had unrivaled access to the White House. You know, the British or French ambassador would call up on Monday and say, do you think there's any possibility I could see the president in the next week or two? And Bandar would call up at 3 p.m. and say, I need to come over at 4. And it used to annoy me a lot. I mean, why should they have this kind of access? But actually, President Bush once said, he's not influencing me, I'm influencing him. This is how, keep them close. This is how I get a message in an hour directly to the king. This is how I get a reply from the king. And it worked. It worked. A little bit of discounting because you knew that, some piece of the message was Vanguard, not the king. You had to figure out, was it 1%, 20%? Basically, it worked. And I think, I fully agree that I think Tom Donilon was for a while the point man for the Saudis. And the system has not yet been fixed so that there's somebody whom they and we view as the key intermediary. And that's very unfortunate because we do want to influence them. Even punching under their weight, they obviously have a lot of influence in, for example, Syria. They have an active Syria policy. They have a very active Bahrain policy. And we want to maximize our own influence, and we're probably not doing it right now.
Yeah. And I think to respond to the U.S. having an active role in steering the Saudi direction, I completely agree with the instinct, but the devil is in the details of actually how you implement that at this time of change in the Middle East. And then what I glided over in my opening statement, but quite clearly, in the first year of the Arab uprisings, 2011 into 2012, the Saudis felt like they were on their heels. They lost partners as they saw it. They thought that the United States and President Obama had thrown Mubarak under the bus. My personal view is that Mubarak had thrown himself under the bus because of the lack of incredible economic and democratic reforms. And you just can only contain popular antipathy so much. On Yemen, they actually played an interesting and continue a constructive role. A curious thing that a monarchy is actually playing a role in sort of mediating a pathway towards what I think could have some potential for continued openness in their political system. Yemen clearly has a lot of terrorism problems and other things. The GCC, but mostly Saudi Arabia, playing that role. Where I think, again, they've really punched far below their weight is this issue of trying to contain Iran. Quite clearly, their response to the situation in Bahrain, they perceive it through a certain lens. Their reaction to that, if it's fair to call it, similar to the Brezhnev doctrine, that we're not going to allow. So they contain that there, but I think the biggest gap, and again I come back to Iraq and their perceptions about Iraq, and the shift inside of Iraq, which I think remains a huge challenge, and it's obviously connected to Syria. And I think when they saw the U.S. administration in September, in particular, walk away from what they thought would be even targeted, limited strikes, they were already in a process of trying to place bets on a number of different actors, and now, based on my most recent trip to eastern Turkey, they and others are all in. And it's I think, presenting a very dangerous, and with some very dangerous groups, perhaps, and perhaps less so Saudi Arabia than other GCC states. But I think by 2014, it's already coming out in the press, but I think this administration even is recognizing that perhaps the threat from these jihadist militants in northern Syria are starting to rival some of the other security threats that the United States faces in the Middle East.
I'm sitting here trying to think of whether I agree that they're punching below their weight. I don't know, and the reason I'm thinking, the comparison that would make that point best is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, right? I mean, Qatar is a very interesting place in the sense that it has no citizens, right? I think it's about 275,000 now. Everybody else is an expat. All there is money, and there has been extremely effective use of that money and of Qatari diplomacy. And if you compare sort of the last 10 years of Qatari diplomacy, Al Jazeera, Qatari diplomacy, Qatari use of money with the Saudis, you would absolutely conclude they punch below their weight. But if you compare it to Iran, Iran has roughly 3 times the population of Saudi Arabia. And the percentage of the population that is, in a sense, involved in the life of the country, that is, for example, has a decent education, are professionals, women who are active in some way in the economy. Iran is a much more modern country than Saudi Arabia. And it isn't surprising in a way that the Saudis would have a very hard time taking on a country with 3 times the population and that is much more modern. It's a sort of striking thing to say about the Ayatollah's Iran, but I think it's true. So I wonder if if really, if you look at the country, even with its wealth, the amazing achievement, maybe one could say, is the Qataris. But if you take them out of the equation, I don't know if Saudi Arabia is really punching below its weight. And in the days when it was punching way above its weight, that was when it was spending all this money to spread extremist ideology around the world.
Yeah.
So that, you had Wahhabi imams and Wahhabi mosques and Wahhabi schools growing up in Indonesia and
Still
Malaysia. Yeah. So that was not a good thing.
Yeah.
So
No, and I'm not casting a judgment value on it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying in terms of, again, and I think the point of the article was that if you had those resources, and if you were in Saudi Arabia and you shared those goals, you certainly could do better. But again, I'm not saying that would be good for U.S. interests, certainly. I'm just trying to clinically analyze it, which I think is important to try to do in the region right now. I mean, I think, an important point, I think, last thing I'd say here is that I think, especially since 2011, but I think it preceded this, the region had slipped into this multi-dimensional, multipolar competition for power. You just talked about Saudi Arabia versus Qatar. That's just one feature of it. And you look at sort of Turkey's role and its purported role and how it, I think in many ways, did not punch above its weight and quite below its weight. We're at a period of transformation that, when I say multidimensional, it's not simply who's backing whom's military forces or armed forces. It's the use of media. It's using money in the way that we saw in Egypt after Morsi's ouster in the coup, quite visibly staking a bet on, and if there's an overall trend in the Middle East, it's a little simplistic, but I think it's true, those countries that are a little bit less economic strong, they lack the wealth, but also divided politically, are quite often sort of these mini Cold Wars of the region are played out in places like Yemen. Lebanon is doing this, and you've known this for years, but it continues to go on. And Syria, I think, right now is the most dangerous place.
So, let's talk about Syria for a second, because I guess in some ways, looking at it, trying to look at it from a Saudi perspective, what's the real issue? Is the issue just that the United States appears to want to rebalance the region, as former National Security Advisor Thomas Donilon said, basically rebalancing the Saudis and the Iranians off of each other, or the Saudis have a case saying, wait a second, our problem is not being rebalanced, our problem is the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's the issue. And I guess in some ways, if you look at Syria, I think Syria might be a more accurate picture of what's happening around the region, like what the Iranians are fighting for and how the Iranians are fighting. So I can just get your thoughts on Syria for a
From the
second.
Saudi point of view, I think it's pretty clear that King Abdullah of Jordan used that phrase, the Shia crescent. From the Saudi point of view, you Americans handed them Iraq, this is a quote that Brian read, and they still have that view. And you're not doing anything about Hezbollah in Lebanon. And now you've got Hezbollah troops and Iranian IRGC troops and expeditionary force, in a sense, in Syria fighting. This is a matter of the Shia becoming the dominant force in the region. And what are you Americans doing about it? Nothing. You don't even recognize it. And all you want to do is negotiate with them. I think that's the fundamental Saudi view. They're fighting to win. And you guys don't even seem to recognize that this is a fight with the Shia. And that is not the American view.
Do they really put it that baldly? I mean, it's not like the problem. It's not the Shia. It's their revolutionary regime, or they're really that upfront about saying
Only
it's a sectarian.
No, I think these are not the speeches, obviously, that officials make, but I think that in addition to the problem for the Saudis of Iran under any management, there is a deep religious conflict here. Rivalry, I was going to say, but I think conflict may be nowadays a better word. And there we have, obviously, an American-Saudi gap. Our problem, as I said, is with the Islamic Republic and its nefarious foreign policy. Our problem is not with Shia or Persians.
Yeah, and well, I would say on the Syria case, I mean, again, another example in my view of how Saudi Arabia has a stated goal. They would like to see Assad go. It's actually in alignment with U.S. policy. I happen to believe that U.S. policy
actually is not in alignment with that stated goal. I think that's an obvious point. If you look at 2013, any serious sort of neutral analyst will say this has been a very good year for the Assad regime in terms of its ability to stay in power. A horrible year, a horrific year for the Syrian people, and even for many people who are part of sort of who are sympathetic to the Assad regime because the conflict continues. But in terms of the state of play, especially since the spring, the wind is a little bit more at the Assad regime's sails. So I would, again, go back to what the stated Saudi ambitions are, and what I've seen on the ground and I've heard from the analysts that I think are credible and go in and out of northern Syria and other places, is the absence of any strategy to advance their goal. And maybe it is the Saudi strategy. Yeah, I mean, it's quite similar to the U.S., but I think you get it in terms of not only the Obama administration's posture, but much of sort of Republican and Democrats in Congress, this reticence to go into. So in fact, you can evaluate it and just say we don't have a strategy that will meet our goals. But the Saudis are doing things. They're doing things in ways that actually, I think, won't, maybe not topple the Assad regime, but almost certainly are creating this security problem that could quite rival, if not already, the challenges we've seen in Yemen or in northwest Pakistan and other places. And that's what I think is the thing that everybody's starting to become aware of. But I fear in 2014, the situation can slip pretty rapidly farther. Well, look, in some of the recent visits I've had there, and it's out there in the press, and Brookings has a really good monograph out yesterday talking about GCC private support to some of these militant groups. The recent sort of trends with Salim Idris leaving and things like this is not an encouraging sign. And again, you can criticize U.S. policy, and I'm happy to do that, because I think there's a gap between the stated goals and what the actual policy is doing on the ground. But I think that gap is even greater, given Saudi's sort of stated self-interest, and as Elliot described it, they're not being terribly effective, I think, with undermining the regime. But
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But, pardon me, but I think if I were a Saudi spokesman, what I would say to you is, right, but that's the fault of the Americans.
Right.
That is, you guys have had a feckless policy from the beginning. Now, what can we do? The Iranians are in there to win. We're trying to fight. We're doing what we can with some help from others in the region. Very hard to do with you Americans on the sideline. But we've kept Assad from winning. We've kept the rebellion alive. Now, it's true that let's call them the non-jihadi elements of the opposition are declining versus the jihadi elements, and that's your fault, you Americans. And you come in with us in the beginning, you wouldn't have had this power vacuum that has led this to be a magnet for jihadis from all over the world. We're not prepared to see Assad win, because that means that Hezbollah and Iran have won in an Arab country. We're not prepared to see that. You handed them Iraq. But Iraq, after all, at least in a sense, is a majority Shia country. This is a country that's 74% Sunni. We're not prepared to see the Shia take it over, and you're not helping. I think it's actually a very powerful argument.
Well, I'll ask you both. I mean, at what point do the Saudis have a real point when they differ with American policy? And at what point is it just when Brian challenged the title of the panel, alliance? No, I think it makes sense. It's not an alliance in that way. It's relationship, right? And it seems to be in lots of ways a problematic relationship. Insofar as Elliot was describing it, a lot of it does have to do with oil for security. And historically, it's been a lot of times the Saudis are screaming at the Americans from the side, do this, do that. And as Elliot was saying before about Bandar and Bush, it's best to lead them, guide them, influence them. But at what point, when the Saudis are saying, this is Elliot was describing, at what point are they right? When they're talking about Syria, when they're talking about Iran, it's either we need you as the superpower leading, or you're wrong on Syria, you're wrong on Iran. So how do we distinguish the noise from when they're correct?
Look, I mean, you could argue, and they would certainly argue, they're already right in this regard. And I would just respond in terms of, again, back to U.S. strategic interests and how, again, having a clear plan of then how does this end and where does this go? If you wanted to go into an all-in strategy in the way that, again, I don't think it won't happen. I almost say for certain, just based on my own assessment from the U.S. side. You look at sort of the fallout from what would have been a failed vote in Congress, I think, on very limited strikes. So selling this case to the American public will require a fundamental change in something that happens on the ground, if not on the order of 9/11, but something sort of
the administration will also have to change. I mean, the administration, the president, has been undermining the policy of doing anything more active in Syria for 2.5 years. So
right,
they're going to have to change as well.
But what I'm suggesting here is that I don't think they'll have that wake-up call unless there's something that is perceived to directly affect U.S. interests. So something like the teetering and collapse of Jordan, which is one of our closest and most steadfast partners and allies. Something on that order will require, and again, it's the administration primarily, but I would say also the United States to wake up to say, look, the Middle East, after 10 or 12 years where, and I testified in Congress at the end of September, early October, on an issue related to the Middle East, and I got it from both sides, saying, why should we care? And for those of us who care about the region, I think what we need to do is outline what is a practical case. And when it comes to Syria, I think a practical case for engagement, if I were advising the administration in a clear way on Syria, it would be, and I think they're doing this to some extent, assess what these actors are doing right now, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and others. We've got a London 11 group. I would focus a little bit more on the ground game, who's doing what on the ground. Right now, a lot of the emphasis is on Geneva 2, and that's going to convene, and God bless them. I wish Lakhdar Brahimi all the best. But to me, diplomacy does not have much of a chance of an impact unless it's linked to power dynamics on the ground. And to me, and I've written a little bit about this, the lack of, fine for Secretary Kerry to talk to Lavrov quite a lot, and with Brahimi, fine channel. What's missing is some sort of regional contact group, difficult though it may be. And Elliot may be skeptical of this, but the Bush administration, when Iraq was at its darkest moment, it took part in regional diplomacy conferences. I think Turkey took the lead on it. And again, maybe it didn't do much practically, but perhaps it was one of those pieces in addition to a military surge that led to a more pragmatic dialogue of how do you actually, at least get to an end to some of the worst behaviors that are leading to the fragmentation of Syria. If that makes sense, there's no regional strategy, as far as I can tell, to shape the actors who are now engaged in Syria.
But we're on the key agreement is things got to go bottom up, not top down. That is, you can't negotiate a deal that doesn't reflect reality on the ground. If you want to do the deal, you do have to have a negotiation, but you've also got to change the reality on the ground.
Yes.
And we're not doing that.
Agreeing on a number of different things.
Well, no,
I hope you're not getting uncomfortable.
But I think the point where I might disagree if we carried it through in terms of specificity of policy, because I think it's easy enough to say, okay, here's what you would do to map out a case to change the balance of power on the ground. But as I think people like Secretary Kerry might tell you, when they made a modest decision in the spring of this year to arm some parts of the rebels, I think there was a delay in doing that, and there's still a slowness in that. And part of it was a low appetite amongst those in Congress. I mean, I'm not blaming them, but there's just no appetite overall. If post 9/11, and I think heading into the Iraq War, there was a great appetite and power to actually shape what the U.S. could do in this part of the world. Unfortunately, I fear it was squandered, and I think it's continued, my personal view, to be squandered in part because we believe sort of this, we made some mistakes, certainly. I've criticized the previous administration, but then we believe then we can't do anything. And I think collectively what I'm saying is not just in the mind of President Obama or others, but across the political spectrum, that there's very little that we can do. And that's what worries me the most. As somebody who I hope to continue to work on this for the next 20 or 30 years, this sense of we don't have power to do anything, which we talk about quite a lot on Egypt, I think. The U.S. policy on Egypt evinces this. It clearly demonstrates that they think they don't have much influence, and I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I would add one point about, I don't know if this is the Saudis punching under their weight or if it's just a fact of life and they don't have the weight. But they're very much opposed to U.S. policy, very critical of U.S. policy. But they're completely unable to do anything about it. It's striking. I mean, that is, they don't have the influence within the administration, and they certainly don't have the influence in the U.S. With the public. They can't move public opinion. Now, maybe that's asking too much of the foreign governments, although at times the British have been able to do it. At times the Israelis maybe have been able to do it. The Saudis, though they spend a ton of money on PR firms in Washington, can't do it. So they're left kind of fuming ineffectively, but haven't moved the needle.
Well, one of the interesting things I did want to come to this is when people have been saying if the Americans are out of the picture, or if that seems that way to the Saudis will look for other options. And we keep hearing about, again, I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but one of the things that we have heard about is excellent coordination, secret but excellent coordination between the Israelis and the Saudis. And one of the things that struck me over the last couple of weeks, the criticism of the interim deal with Iran, is many of the people, including myself, used to writing critical appraisals of this administration, will not just write, and it's not good for our allies in Israel, but it's also not good for our allies in Saudi Arabia. So to yoke these two things together, this is kind of different. So in some ways I think that the Saudis might be benefiting from the fact that they and the Israelis are in line, at least on Iran policy.
But I would suggest, some have suggested this could then more expansively, lead to something else, and I think there are just inherent limits to whatever tactical cooperation there could be on Iran, and I think the biggest issue for the Saudis, again, will be the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That, if you look at those statements back in 2002, 2003, and your administration was on the receiving end of that, it's still an important core issue. Now, again, the other place I might push back here a little bit is that I think that when people talk about the U.S. not being present in the region and we're less of a force, I think that's highly inaccurate. You go, as I did this fall, and you see what our footprint is like in the GCC states. If you read Secretary Hagel's speech in Bahrain, and we can all have problems with how he said that and what he said, it's quite clear that there's no other military force that will rival. And if you look at the planning of the Pentagon, even at a time of budget cuts, I see no sign of retreat of U.S. in the region. Separately, and maybe this is the way to segue into Iran, also on the interim deal, there's been a lot of talk about a major shift here as well, potentially. The U.S. and Tom Donilon hinted at this. I would say that this is probably more modest than has been portrayed when you look at not only the fact that the security threats that Iran presents to U.S. core strategic interests, their support for terrorist groups and other things. The fact that we've been there for decades in the region, I don't actually see us retreating in any way. If we were going to do that, we might have done that in Bahrain or other places if we really wanted to make that a clear issue. But even if, and I was talking to people in the administration dealing with the sanctions on Iran, they made an interesting point, said even if, on the slim chance that we can get to a final agreement, and I don't think there's any naivete about that, the set of sanctions that will still remain in place because of Iran's missiles program, its support for terror organizations, this is a country we have significant problem with. And I think, just from a cool calculus, I don't think, again, I think it's portrayed differently in the media debate about the interim agreement, but I don't think this yet represents anything but sort of an attempt at diplomacy that may not succeed ultimately.
And what is the purpose of the interim agreement? We spoke about this a bit before.
I think if you go back to 2009, the president comes to office wishing to engage. The theory that a large part of the problem with countries like Syria and Iran was the Bush administration, was Bush policy. And now we will engage. And that he could not do because of the events in Iran in June 2009. The uprising, the way it was crushed, you couldn't then engage with the government of Iran. And remember, the engagement is not with Iran, it's not with the people of Iran. The engagement is with the regime in Iran, as it was with the Assad regime. Okay, so in 2009 you can't do that. Flash forward Now it looks as if there's a possibility. After all, there is, for the first time, official engagement. There are foreign minister to secretary of state negotiations. So as I look at it, I think people in the region who are scared of this and say, we have lived in a world where there's an Iranian-American confrontation. And if the Americans no longer want that confrontation, believe they can end it almost single-handedly, believe that Iran has changed enough so that there needn't be a confrontational attitude, they're going to get scared. And in fact, they are scared, because from their point of view, the Israelis are concerned about one thing, which is nukes. But for the Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, and others, that's just one issue.
Yeah.
And it may not even be the top issue. There's terrorism, there's subversion, there's the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, there's the Shia majority Bahrain, there's the old desire for hegemony over what is either the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. So I can understand why, even in the context of having an agreement with Israel, or let's say not an agreement, common interests about the Iranian nuclear program, they see that the United States, the Europeans, Israel have a very different, or perhaps have a very different fundamental position with respect to Iran.
I was going to say, this is why I think Syria is an important test case in many ways, because when people talk about the Iranians, it's not an expansive power, they never really fight themselves. I think if you were talking to the Saudis, I think if you were talking to the Emiratis and Kuwaitis, they'd say, well, we've had problems with them here at home, but if you need more evidence, look at what they've done in Syria. I mean, as you said before, it's an expeditionary force. And no matter what happens to Assad, it seems that the Iranians stand to profit in the meantime. So Saudi concerns there certainly make sense.
And I think they would echo those concerns about Iraq. I mean, we did this thing before, but again, I think it's an important one to make is that we didn't cause sort of the chaos in the region, but our actions do have an impact. And I think the shift from a strategic paradigm of dual containment of both Iran and Iraq, which was probably not a good long-term sustainable strategy in and of itself, but it had consequences. And it had consequences when you talk to people in Saudi Arabia inside of Iraq. I saw Prime Minister Maliki recently when he was here on his visit. And the whole, what I'm suggesting is that the whole sort of region is in this period of competition for influence. It's changing. I think it often is thrown in these labels of Shia versus Sunni, and I think it's accurate to some extent, and Elliot and I have debated this as well, but I think the fracturing inside of the Middle East, because the Sunni axis, so to speak, we debated this as well, is itself fractured. And I think when I go to places where our most reliable partners and allies like Israel or Jordan, when they look at the regional conception, and the Israelis say this quite a lot, is that we used to fear Arab strength and coherence. Now what we fear is weakness. And I think, again, this paints a muddled picture, but I think that's what it is. It is a muddled picture in the Middle East, and I think, for me, as somebody who's often critical of either the Bush administration or my friends in the Obama administration of the lack of a U.S. strategy, as an honest analyst from the outside, it's easier for me to sort of sit there and write papers, but then when you're trying to deal with these competing interests and values, it's easier said than done.
This is good. Let me ask you both then, if it's okay, before, because I do want to open it up for some questions. But let me ask you both, Brian, since you mentioned this a few times, what would, if you think that the strategic vision has fallen apart or it's muddled, what do you think is a clear and far-sighted strategic vision in the Middle East, and what role does Saudi Arabia play for the foreseeable future? I mean, I'll just leave it at that. What role do the Saudis play in a clear-sighted American strategy?
I would say, if we're talking long-term, I would start with, it depends what kind of Saudi Arabia we're talking about, and the issues that we've glided over and not talked about much, but the shaping of Saudi future and things like this, because to me, the most reliable partners with the United States in the Middle East are countries like Israel, and then I think Jordan has its own challenges with political inclusion and economic development, but you want societies that have a fabric of more inclusivity and openness. And, you know, people like to malign the freedom agenda. Before the freedom agenda was the gleam in George W. Bush's eye, I was in the Middle East working as, on democratic promotion. I fundamentally believe that. So I think one thing is how you elevate that pragmatically. in our interests, recognizing that we're not the ones that are going to steer the change, but it's going to be part of the dialogue. I know with U.S. Saudi Arabia, there was a strategic dialogue with the Bush administration, and if I recall, there was at least nominally a working group on human rights and democracy. I don't know if it did anything.
It made us feel better.
Yeah. So more crisply, I mean, I think what strikes me, and this is, I think, a problem that cuts across many administrations, is quite often we stovepipe sort of our interests and our values. And when you go, and the discussion you have in CENTCOM or in our military or in our intelligence agencies is quite different than what some people in the State Department, and maybe I'm unrealistic, but I think there could be a much more practical blending of these issues. The one point I would just say is that in this sort of mix in the Middle East, to me, the fundamental that seems to be undergirding all of this is that these societies are at the start of a change, transformation, and being more adept at trying to guide them. When you look at how flaccid and weak the State Department structures are, when you look at the Dovel Partnership and the G8, and just the lack of, when you measure that up against what these other states have done in places like Egypt. So I think the main point would be, what can we do in terms of the lessons learned? Because there's been a lot of ad hominem criticism of the Bush administration's freedom agenda, but what are the real lessons learned of actually how do we elevate democracy promotion and reform while also being pragmatic, while also attending to our day-to-day interests? And I think that's easier said than done, but I don't know if Elliot has a reaction to that.
You could rephrase your question. What would Herman Kahn say if you were here today about the future strategy? Yes, you're in Hudson. I think it depends partly on what you're looking at, 10 years and 50 years. If we're talking, let's say 10, 20, 25 years, a period in which American dependence on Middle Eastern oil will decline. I agree, first of all, that one of the key variables here is, well, tell me what's going on in those societies. We didn't predict the turmoil in so many Arab countries that we've seen since 2011. What will Saudi Arabia be like 5, 10 years from now? Will it be a generally calm society? Will it be a revolutionary society? I think, some of the issues that Saudis face are the internal issues that, as Brian said, we haven't talked very much about. I used to work for Senator Moynihan, and he once said that the most disruptive thing in any society, including the United States, is unemployed young men. Unemployed young men are dangerous. Saudis have a very, very large number of unemployed young men. And they're not, you can even say they have a very large number of unemployable young men whose education is such that the idea that they're going to find a job next year, hard to believe. So that's a very big variable. How will, we're in the final years, statistically speaking, of the rule of Crown Prince Abdullah, King Abdullah. Who's the next king? What kind of a king will he be? What kind of reforms will there be in Saudi Arabia to address issues like the mismatch between their educational system and the needs of the coming decades? Big variable. The other one I would throw in is, look, it's the Islamic Republic. I mean, that's the security issue in the region. Someday, I believe, the Islamic Republic will fall, and the people of Iran will get what they want, which is a decent, just, democratic society. It may take 5 years, it may take 35 years, who knows? Until that day comes, it seems to me the strategy of the United States has got to be the main bulwark against the extremism, the subversion, the terrorism, the aggression of the Islamic Republic. Because our friends in the region can't do it without us. And I think this administration has at best, an unclear policy in this respect, which has made all of our friends nervous.
And this is where I'll disagree a little bit, because I think, again, there's more continuity in that policy. If you look at U.S. policy since 1979 and contained since the Islamic Revolution, one fundamental has been containing the Iranian influence. Under the Bush administration, I think in the last 2 years in particular, there was a different strategy that began of both contain and continue to contain, and then amp up sort of the containment through global economic sanctions, while also engaging. through this P5+1. And when I talked about continuity, I think that's there. That's the paradigm in terms of testing what the possibilities are. But I think the overall architecture, both our security posture, how our intelligence agencies view Iran, that has not fundamentally changed. And I think we are, that's where we'll probably disagree a little bit, because I think people overread sort of even these diplomatic engagements and these attempts at diplomacy. To me, the fundamental architecture is quite consistent. Where it all goes is the big question. And then the second point I'd raise up is that this whole issue of containment, the bargains that we met, if not alliances, the partnerships that we built, the Faustian bargains, if you will, with some of these actors like Saudi Arabia, the subject of our talk today, is the thing that we should question. What were the costs and what were the benefits of that cooperation strategically and tactically? To me, and that's where I think, this issue of long-term, how these societies treat their own people, the sense of decency and standards, is terribly important now for the region itself, because these regimes understand that themselves, that they can't turn back this tide. So again, all of the criticisms of the attempts at reform in the region, and what I think, my main criticism is that too much of it became militarized or securitized from the U.S. standpoint. Our engagement in the region post-Iraq, unfortunately, in the analysis has been that, but there has been an under-analysis of what could be done with our economic policies, what could be done with our diplomacy to actually foster better change. And maybe we just want to give up and go home, but I think the real downside to this whole paradigm of containing Iran is we built these alliances with regimes themselves that are built on sand, that I think live in bubbles themselves, that I don't see sustaining themselves over the long term.
Let me just agree on one point about continuity. You had this extraordinary event of Iran plotting to blow up the Saudi ambassador in the Cafe Milano in Georgetown. And the American reaction to that was nothing. That's continuity. Because the Iranians have been killing Americans and plotting to kill Americans for decades under several presidents of both parties. And the American reaction almost always is nothing. We've seen it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it in Beirut, we've seen it in Saudi Arabia, Omar. And we never actually reply. So that, from my point of view, unfortunately, proves your point. The Iranians have paid almost no price for this under administration after administration, which, unfortunately, I think emboldens them and leads them. You'd like to think there was a debate in Tehran about whether it was wise to try to blow up a restaurant in Georgetown, with some people saying, you're crazy, it's an act of war, and others saying, nah, they won't do anything. And the people who said the latter, unfortunately, were right.
Yeah. Or there may not have been any debate at all. That's a pretty good idea. And the Americans aren't going to do anything.
Maybe.
Why don't we open it up for a few questions? We have the gentleman in the front. If you would, I believe we have a microphone. So we can ask you to wait until the microphone arrives, and then introduce yourself, and please try to keep it brief so we can get to an answer to your question. Pardon me? A minute? Okay.
One variable that we talked about, the economic impact of the relationship with Saudi Arabia in terms of jobs. If you look at the relationship and quantify it, we benefit from job creation, sale of arms, sanitation services, over 30,000 it's quite substantial. Now, on the question of whether the Saudis think we're leaving or not, Brian and I were in Bahrain. No one believes that we will leave, but they're concerned about that we're not using our power to change the status quo in Syria. But they know we're there, and they need us there. Finally, Brian mentioned the fact that there's no close coordination. When you talk to the Saudis, they talk about Bush 41. And they'll tell you, we had a great relationship. We didn't always agree, but they consulted us. We were aware of what's going on. And now, for example, they'll tell you about the negotiations with Iran. And Prince Turkey in Bahrain, and also France, said, we should be included in the negotiations about the Iranian nuclear development because we're impacted by it, and yet we're not included.
I'm sorry, can you phrase that as a question now? What's that? Okay.
Well, look, just to respond, and quite obviously, I think those linkages we did not explore the economic linkages between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, but they're vital, they're important. What I would say is also, and again, we often think about the Middle East, just sort of Saudi Arabia's relationships north to the west. What struck me and strikes me on my visits to the region is also those growing linkages, not only to China with energy, but the whole Gulf, but also Saudi Arabia. The fact that remittances, and I've looked quite a lot at India and Pakistan more so in some of my work, and those linkages are quite important as well. And we often have that stovepipe discussion about sort of our policies, but they view this as very important. You know, and I don't, you know, I agree with the rest of your comments. I sympathize a lot with them. I don't know if you have any other reactions.
Hillel, I see Hillel in back. I guess there's a microphone coming back there. Does that mic work okay? I think we had a little trouble. The gentleman in the audience was signaling that
Does
he
this
had
work?
trouble here.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Hello, Franklin of the Hudson Institute. I want to thank everyone for the discussion and also for the commendation of the current trends. I guess my question really is for Brian Katulis. I guess it starts from your dissatisfaction, it seems to me, with our Syria policy at the moment. But the president has now said that Syria is someone else's civil war. So I wonder what you think is the argument for why it is something else that would be persuasive within the administration, or for that matter, to the American public. It would seem to me, anyway, that the argument would be it's not merely a civil war, or not merely Syria's civil war, but it's a regional civil war, a Sunni Shiite war, and that we have a concern about that. And that, as Elliot, I think, suggested, Iran, that side, is winning. So that would be, it seems to me, the issue that would have to be raised, but I wonder how you make that argument when we're also embracing Iran at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think I would add to the fact that the spillover that you're seeing already in terms of security threats in Lebanon, in Turkey, it seems fairly contained in Jordan, but then Iraq, the regional implications, they're rolling out as we speak. I think that probably the thing that would only move, and here I'm talking about the American public, because I think I see our political leaders from President Obama, but then especially the members of Congress, they're reactive in a sense, especially after 10 years of what I think, again, erroneously was seen as like, you know, bad engagement on the part of the U.S. Yes, we made mistakes, but that engagement, had we stuck with it in some ways, could have lasting impact. I think the only thing that would really sort of be a wake-up call, unfortunately, would be a major terrorist event, not like what we saw in Rehanle in Turkey, but something emanating from northern Syria. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that it's not inconceivable that this happens. In the way that I think the bombing, the attempted jetliner bombing in December of 2009, on Christmas Day, was a wake-up call about AQAP. My fear, it's not my hope, it's my fear, is that something similar to this, because that provoked a response from the administration. And people can agree or disagree with it, but it was a brutal response. It was effective. It had impact.
It had me a little concerned that C-SPAN viewers might take matters into their own hands. Sure, it's not a recommendation.
No, it's a worry given the when you look at even just sort of the news accounts of who's showing up and the types of weapons they have and the plots that they might have in the backing that they might have. Right now it seems internally focused on the Assad regime. That, Hillel, I think, less so than the regional argument. I think a regional argument flies over the heads of many congressmen. I mentioned my experience testifying recently, but the American public, even especially those who served maybe in some of these places in Iraq and others, people are, I think, just in a cool calculus are looking at what did we actually achieve? Was the juice worth the squeeze? And I think that's unfortunate. And I think I'm not calling for it again, but I fear that that's what will produce a wake-up call, given we're going into a midterm election, given that we're so still internally focused, and given just the hyper-dysfunction that we see in our own political system.
I would just say, I think, I agree that in Congress and we know from the public, there was remarkably little support I think that had the president done it and then gone on TV and done one of these last night and said to the American people, we do not want to leave to our children a world in which chemical weapons are back, chemical weapons are used, chemical weapons are part of the everyday arsenal. We can't allow that. And so I have done the following. It's over. It happened last night. I think actually he could have gotten a substantial amount of support, but you'll never know.
But in reality then, if you look at where things are going with the deal that was struck, you still would have had the open question of the weapons are not secured. Now they're on a pathway. I'm arguing, I don't think this was a well thought out strategy. It was a lucky strategy. But had they done that, and I wrote a piece, I generally was supportive of the proposal, as limited as it was, but the main point of my piece was that there were inherent risks at that time. The assumption, for instance, that it would have deterrent value on the Assad regime, I think, was one that needed to be questioned by the analysts. Because if Assad used it not only once, as we know from the UN report recently, many more than once, this could have produced much more of an incentive. So I would say that for all of sort of the zigzag, and it was quite a confusing and messy period, the United States, Israel, again, I was in Israel in November, everybody's happy that these weapons are now on what seems to be, and again, seems to be a pathway for elimination and secure. And that is a major, if anything, the conflict is still raging, Assad seems stronger, but the securing of the chemical weapons, we should not undermine sort of what an important accomplishment that was.
Let me undermine that accomplishment. For two reasons. One, I don't think that Assad is giving up his chemical weapons. I think he's giving up a portion of his chemical weapons. I don't know whether it's 10%, 50%, 70%, I don't know. It is not sensible from the Assad point of view to give up 100%, nor do you have to do it. The weapons that we are taking and destroying are the weapons that the regime has identified. So, first. Secondly, wow, what a price we paid. The price we paid is that we used to have a policy of getting rid of Assad. Assad now seems to be our partner. And you don't hear anybody saying anymore, Assad must go. What you hear is people close to the administration doing op-eds saying, well, Assad may not be as bad as the alternative. Ryan Crocker, for example, distinguished diplomat, dead wrong on Syria.
No, I mean, I would just amend that, you said we had a policy of getting rid of Assad. I would just friendly amendment that we had a stated policy.
I agree.
Stand over here.
And the third row.
Thank you very much for putting together this excellent panel. Sure, I will be happy to. I'm too tall, that's why. Okay, Abbas Kadam with the Iraqi Embassy. It's so good to see a discussion on Saudi Arabia like this. But I want to pick on a couple of things you mentioned, Mr. Abrams. One of them is, of course, this strong Saudi argument that 70% of the population, it's not a good idea to have them ruled by 30%. Maybe an equally strong argument that they are sending troops to maintain such a minority. The Bahrainis are also 70% of a different religion. And also the Iraqis, the Saudis done more than anybody else to bring back 17% of minority rule. By the way, these two counter arguments, it can be also made the opposite way to the Iranians. Minority rule as such, all oppressive regimes being equal, is not such a bad idea. It depends on whose minority it is. But the other one that I want to pick on what you said, which is I think more consequential, is the idea that it is the Saudi problem is more of a Shia strong state in Iran rather than this American problem, which is the Islamic Republic that is an unfriendly regime. So even if Iran were to change, this conflict between the Iranians and the Saudis will remain for a long time. Now, from the perspective of the countries who live in the shadow of this conflict that has been destructive to them, whether it's Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and the list goes on, any single crisis that has been happened, it's almost in one dimension a function of a Saudi-Iranian conflict. If that is such a fatalism that they will always be having this problem, whether it's from the Iranian side or the Saudi side, where would this take the stability of the region? I would like to have you, and also Brian, your work is well known on Iran. Maybe I'll save it for another day to talk to you.
Thanks.
Just a quick answer. On the minorities, I agree with you. I mean, it seems to me the situation in Bahrain is quite unstable, just as the situation in Syria was unstable, where you have, you can debate the numbers somewhat, but clearly a minority ruling majority, and the minority doesn't like it, doesn't want it, won't put up with it anymore. So the problem is that in different ways both governments have not responded by saying, well, let's negotiate a better dispensation. I agree with the second part also. The Saudi problem is a Shia strong state in Iran. That's not the American problem. In the long run, I think, let me try to cheer you up. Once upon a time, the United States had a strong alliance with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and a strong alliance with Iran under the Shah. And we were able to kind of mediate. If the Islamic Republic falls, which I hope and pray, then we will have a good relationship with the follow-on government, presumably with a democratic regime. And maybe we can go back to the days, 60s, 70s, where the United States was able, as the strongest military power in the region, to be a buffer between Saudi Arabia and Iran and try to help maneuver the relationship between them.
The Nixon doctrine.
No, the Nixon doctrine, to a certain extent, appointed the Shah as the sheriff in the region. I'm not talking about that.
But the Saudis are honorary member in that.
They had a different kind of star, though. I think the United States could be in a position to do that once we achieve a decent relationship with Iran, and that cannot happen, I think, as long as the Islamic Republic survives.
If I could just make a comment and direct it on Iraq, because I think we haven't talked as much about it, and my own view, which if you've read my papers through the years, is quite clear. And this is where Elliot and I probably strongly disagree, and many sort of in the audience. I thought the Iraq War was a grievous mistake. I wasn't a big fan of Saddam Hussein, but then also, all of the mistakes after. And if you recall, I know 2005, 6, 7, I wrote papers that some would say shaped sort of where we've gone. I was in favor of strategic redeployment and those arguments. If you look at those papers carefully, especially the 2007 one, it talked about the need for a continued robust engagement with Iraq. And that, what I think, and I thought it was understandable that the Iraqi government at the end of the Bush administration demanded a hard deadline because there was an assertion of sovereignty. And I find it interesting that the foreign minister of Iraq is now going to Afghanistan and giving advice to their government there. But I understood it, and my clinical analysis again was that looking at trends inside of Iraq, this doesn't seem tenable. But the other agreement, the bilateral, the strategic framework agreement, which again seems bureaucratic, but I think cuts to this issue of this question of what would U.S. strategy do. These things, the strategic framework agreement had not only security cooperation, has, not had. We shouldn't talk about it in past tense because it's still a live, living document, or at least on paper. It had the full length of sort of cultural, diplomatic, economic cooperation, the absence of follow-through. And this is in part because of inattention at the top, I think, in administrations, but also because of these fundamental bureaucratic problems in some of these agencies in following up. Also because of problems inside of Iraq. I stated in this context of Iran as a discussion because, again, I was against the Iraq War, but then I'm a pragmatist. I went in and worked for NDI on the ground for a bit there. You do what you can with what you've got. And I think to this day it's a missed opportunity. I think that Iraq has the potential, as big of the problems they face with terrorism and internal divisions, to serve in the future as some sort of bridge in the region, a constructive bridge. But I think I would criticize the Iraqi government for not following up sufficiently on these tools of bilateral engagement, but I'd also say the U.S. is a great deal at fault here. This is a missed opportunity to take a sad song and make it better, for U.S. policy.
There's a gentleman in the fourth row, I believe, the dark shirt, and we'll come up to the gentleman in the second row.
Hi, Masood. I'm a student. So basically, Saudi Arabia, Iran have this rivalry, and my question is, would there be a way that the tension between these two could be eased, given Iran as it is right now, and Saudi Arabia as a situation we don't know, but as it is right now as well. So is there a way that this tension could be eased? And if so, what role the U.S. has to play?
I mean, look, if I could just say, I think the only way they can be eased in the long run is if there's fundamental change, which I think the conditions are present for in both societies at the societal level. If you look at the strategic paradigm of the Iranian leaders and the Saudi leaders, there looks to be, or seems to be, a fundamental incompatibility. I mean, at times they can cooperate and have diplomatic meetings, but if you look at the societal level, there's nothing naturally inherent that should lead to. And this, again, it seems soft, or especially 10 years after the Freedom Agenda, incomplete, and nobody can do anything about it. But these societies, I think, are going to evolve. And when you talk to ordinary Iranians or you talk to ordinary Saudis, there's nothing inherently that should make them at odds. And that's why I think right now it doesn't seem like. And here a little bit, I think Elliot mentioned, we tend to lump the UAE and Qatar and the GCC states together, but I wouldn't. There's serious divergence when it comes, especially with Oman. And I think it made it obvious. But I think even the Emiratis have a quite different view than the Saudis when it comes to Iran. I mean, they have their own security problems, and it's not just about the nuclear agreement, but they also have business interests that were quite considerable and that were cut off by the sanctions that the Bush administration and then the Obama administration continued to work through the P5+1. So my main point, I mean, I think your general question leads to somewhat of a general answer. That in the short run, I don't see sort of the clear opportunities for cooperation, but I think in the long run, if these societies evolve in the way that I think it's difficult to predict, but in a trajectory towards a more progressive, open, inclusive view in their own societies, there's more opportunity then for them to cooperate. Presently, no.
The gentleman in the second row.
My name is Stuart Rothman. I'm just an ordinary citizen who has keenly observed that the media and the analysts have characterized this administration's policy as being muddled, reactive, anything but positive. So my question to you is, if you could wave a magic wand and establish U.S. policy in the region, what would that policy be, and how would you execute it?
In 25 words or less.
Yeah. Well, actually, we have been trying to focus on that precise issue, especially regarding Saudi Arabia. I mean, maybe does it make sense to...
Well, people in the region, this is a big generalization, but I think it's fair. People in the region see the United States as a declining power in the region. Some like it, some hate it, but I think it characterizes most people in the region, Israeli, Arab, Iranian. And to me, the fundamental change that's needed in American policy today is to change that. That is, to make it clear that not only do we retain the basis, but that we're going to use our power. I think it's very hard to do that, by the way, without changing policy towards Syria, because that's the place where the struggle is most direct right now. But that would be the largest change that I would make in the short run. In the long run, there's a very deep question here about how the United States relates to changing societies and governments in particularly the Arab world. I share Brian's view that the Saudi, for that matter, Israeli criticism of President Obama for throwing Mubarak under the bus is completely wrong, completely unjustified. But there is a very big question of how do we relate to societies that on the spectrum are pretty far over toward the unfree, although they may be friendly to the United States. We're going to have to work that out over the next 25 or 50 years. But right now, 2014, if you want to try to prove to people in the region that the United States is not a power that is receding, you can't do that without having a different Syria policy.
Let me answer, because as an outside analyst, I see my first job to be a constructive critic of what present policy is, and I think in my discussions here, I let my criticisms get ahead of what I think are actually some decent policies from the Obama administration and start from there, but then say this is what I would do differently. Look, I would first say I would characterize it as pragmatic, given sort of the realities of the complexity of the situation. To my taste, it leans back the overall position a little bit too much, and we should lean in a little bit more. I think the fundamentals of what I think is, you could say, is a strategy, the two number one priorities, quite clearly from Secretary Kerry's time in office, but the President is solidly backing him, are attempting some sort of deal with Iran on the nuclear issue while being clear-eyed about it, and then second, attempting to advance the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, which is something successive administrations have done. Well, whether they'll succeed or not, I think everybody is clear-eyed about what the odds are, given the challenges in the Palestinians and the Israelis' understandable position about their security concerns. Those are two pillars. You can criticize whether that's an important strategy. I happen to believe that those priorities are important. Add to it a third, which is a strand that is consistent with the Bush administration, a sharp focus on counterterrorism in places like Yemen and around the world. Again, I would highlight this is one place where we need to think more clearly. The Syria crisis, Libya as well, which has fallen off the map, is emerging as a potential challenge in North Africa. But the overarching thing that I think is missing, and has been missing from U.S. policy, not only in this administration, but the Bush administration, I would say the Clinton administration, and backwards, is this broader focus of how do we actually use the tools of our not only diplomacy but economic statecraft, because our military is strong. Let's be clear, and I think our footprint, we may disagree about whether the U.S. is leaving or not. I don't see it leaving in the region. But how do we actually help ourselves in terms of building partnerships with these countries that have this jobs crisis, these fundamental issues? I wrote a book called The Prosperity Agenda. If you read it, it talks about, and again, it dabbles in the space of smart power, which was a nice phrase used in the first administration. But I happen to believe we tend to undervalue those components of U.S. power, and we actually don't know how to bring them to bear. Again, back to my point on Iraq and what I was trying to say on the Strategic Framework Agreement. All of those tools, the remarkable power, no matter what China's rise looks like in India and things like this, when you look at, we're still very strong, and people look to us as a place to invest and also to get investment from. Those tools are just underutilized in the Middle East, much of our relationships. So that I think is a big space, if combined and interlinked with the need for governance reform, democracy, things like this, to the broader point of, after 30 years of the U.S. invested so much, and so much in terms of a security footprint, and I was glad we did that. It still seems incomplete. The region still seems fraught with all of these problems, and in part it was for the reasons I was trying to say. We build alliances with systems themselves that were not economically or politically sustainable or responsive to the demographic, social, and political trends. So that's the thing that I would, but the last thing I'd say is it seems like an academic case now, that after the last decade of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, the pessimism that exists amongst Democrats and Republicans, politically, amongst the American public, educating them that if we can't have the money for a Marshall Plan, we can do a marshalling plan, in a sense, and work with other partners. What I fear is that nobody cares. What I fear is that Elliot and I and Lee and those of us who get paid to write on this stuff, and those who, we're a smaller community in terms of who's paying attention, that we squandered that opportunity a bit after 9/11. And I hope we can build it back, because I actually think our leadership could be important if we built those tools up.
I'm going to ask the final question, and if you could both, I guess we have about 4 minutes left, or even a little less. We spoke before about how the Saudis are concerned that they no longer really have a go-to guy in Washington. I guess I would ask both of you to imagine that you are the Saudis' go-to guy in Washington. And what do you tell them? What do you tell them that they need to do? And what do you tell them that you believe also the United States needs to do to cement a relationship, might not be an alliance, but to make this relationship healthier, to make it more functional, as it may or may not be right now. So actually, Brian, I'd ask you to start, and Elliot, for you to conclude.
Well, I would have three top items on the agenda. Number one, obviously Iran, and if we're going into the next year, these requests for a P5+2 that includes the GCC, I don't think are practical, but there must be ways to read them in to buy them in, to say this is what we're trying to do. Because again, I think you take a cool, hard look at where the U.S. and P5+1 position is and where Iran is, it seems very difficult to bridge. So informing them so that what I saw on recent trips to the Gulf as sort of hyperbolic, concerns about, and even getting some questions of where is the secret annex about dividing Bahrain and Syria, and it's easy enough, I think, through a process of not getting into all the details, but say on the Iran front, we're trying this, but we're still here with the security footprint. That's what Secretary Hagel, I think, was trying to do. Second, Syria, assessing who's doing what on the ground. Not only planning for Geneva II, and again, I'm skeptical that it will succeed, but you need a sense of the ground game and a connection to the powers on the ground, the balanced power on the ground. Third, I would not leave Egypt off the map. Egypt is the largest country in the Middle East. It's my most recent report, big report study I did with Michael Hanna on this. Again, and Elliot and I have worked on Egypt quite a lot. We may have slight tactical differences, but I think the fight for Egypt, the struggle for Egypt, is moving in a direction that is very worrisome, and the Saudis are playing a role in it. I'd keep that on the agenda, and having them be more constructive. The last thing I'd say to them on all fronts, and again, maybe taking some lessons learned from the last 10 years of attempts to get the Saudis to recognize that simply continuing the subsidies regime on energies that you have for your own population, continuing to throw little bones in terms of political reform, are not likely to sustain your own position. That some sort of pragmatic opening up, the elevation of the democracy and human rights agenda in a way that's not counterproductive, I would have as part of that discussion. Probably more private, but maybe in most egregious cases, very public, calling them out. But calling them out in a way that it says it in their self-interest, that we believe it's in your own self-interest, that we want to build a partnership, because we've had a partnership for a while. But to me, again, the main point I'd say is that the most solid partnerships that we have are not only with those countries that we share strategic interests, but also have a greater sort of overlap of values as well. And I do think that that's a potential in Saudi Arabia. I think that's there, but it needs a considerable amount of work.
I don't disagree with any of that. I think that's very wise. I would add that I think we should be talking to the Saudis more effectively, if we could, about this question of support for extremism. This is very dangerous, and it's going to be very dangerous for them, and they should have learned that lesson already. To some extent, the government has. I think it's more careful in Asia, for example, and to some extent in Africa in the way government money is spent, but there's really no, at least I don't see any serious effort to control the vast amounts of private money that are going into some of the worst groups in the world. So I would want to have that conversation with them. And then we come back to something that Ryan said, and we're in agreement, and that is the nature of Saudi society and the challenges they face, which you can look at from the human rights point of view, or you can look at it from a point of view that may be more palatable to the royal family, which is that this is going to be an increasingly unstable situation, and they have not effectively dealt with it. For example, the educational system. And you've got one or two experiments like King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which is great for the people who go there, but has a very limited impact on the rest. And the thing that worries me is that we want to have this conversation, but we're doing it, to go back to something I said at the beginning, we're doing it at a time of potential instability over the succession in Saudi Arabia. So I don't know what, that probably limits our ability, even now, to have this influence. It's something we should have been trying to do over the last decades, and it may be that we're not going to have another good chance to do it until the succession is over and until you have someone as king who might be king for 10 or 20 more years. That's a worrisome diagnosis, but I think it may be unfortunately true.
Thank you. I believe that will conclude the panel. I want to thank Brian and Elliot. Thank you. And thanks to Hudson Institute.